Thanks for joining us for our SOD 3.0 breakout session. My name is Mick McGarry. You probably would have seen me at the general session. Joining me today is Joe Frankowski, who is a managing director here at GRC. Before we get into the course content, just again, the quick housekeeping items here, just like in the previous session, we're going to be asking questions with Poll Everywhere. So if you could, as it says here, maybe we could go to the screen, just take care of this housekeeping. If you could go to pollev.com/SOD052021, so SOD and today's date, and check in there, then you'll be able to participate in the discussion where we're going to be asking some questions as we go along here. Other than that, just we're going to try to keep everybody muted. We can try to do questions here if we can fit it in. So just like in the last section, if you'd like to ask a question, you can put them in the lower right-hand corner in the QA section. So if everybody's clear on the housekeeping, I think we'll dive in to the content here. So just for an agenda that we're going to try to get to here in the next 26 minutes, what we're here to talk about today is SOD, or separation of duties, and how that's evolved really over the years. And we're calling this SOD 3.0, next generation separation of duties. So we'll give you an overview of what that is. Then we're going to jump into what we've developed as a target operating model around SOD to help with this. And then we're going to be actually showing some a quick case study on how this can be enabled through a tool called FastPath that is an alliance partner of ours that we work with. And then if there is time at the end, we will try to get to all of your questions.
Extracting one sec.
All right. So maybe we can move to the next slide, Pam. All right. So I think just to level set the conversation, I love to give this example. And this is, if you guys are not familiar with this documentary, I could not recommend it more for you to check it out. It used to be on Netflix. Now it's on Amazon Prime Video, but it's called All the Queen's Horses. And it tells the story of a woman who worked for the small town of Dixon, Illinois, and she embezzled $53 million from this small town that really didn't have $53 million to lose. And she kind of, did it under the guise of when we had the, the financial downturn around 2008, 2009 to 2011, kind of blamed it on the economy, where she was really just stealing money hand over fist. And really what it all came down to was she had access to everything. She was cutting the checks, she was reconciling the bank accounts, and really when you talk about SOD, there was absolutely none. And it's very interesting what she did with all her winnings, which is why this is called All the Queen's Horses, is she kind of built up a world-class organization for show horses, and she was really successful. And all of her coworkers really didn't think twice about where she's getting all this money. I think she, let on that she had had a big inheritance come or something like that, but really she was just robbing them blind. So it's a really interesting story about how SOD can lead to a lot of problems, and their auditors came under fire, and it's just a really interesting story, and I couldn't recommend it enough for you guys to watch it if this is a topic of interest for you. But that just sets the table that this is why we're here, right? These are the events that make the papers that we're trying to make sure we can avoid. So why don't we move on to the next slide, and we're going to talk about some of the trends we're seeing in the marketplace right now. And we hit on some of these things in the general session. If you recall, we're calling this innovation for better and for worse, right? So for better, right, we've got all this real-time access to data, right? Data at our fingertips. Mobile, right, anywhere through cloud, right? This is what we want to help us run our businesses more efficiently. But these things come at a price, right? So as access to data gets proliferated throughout the organization, more real-time, easy access to data, how are we securing that, right? And so one of the things we're seeing in a big way, and I'm sure your organizations are no different, is this push to the cloud, right? SAP is pushing everything to the cloud, right? They've got S/4HANA, and they are really pushing, with this new RISE program to get S/4HANA to the cloud. They've got their connected apps, Ariba, Concur, SuccessFactors, C4HANA, and on, right? They're all pushing you to the cloud, right? And this is really spanning, again, across front, middle, and back office. These days where you had one ERP that's on premise, sits behind your four walls of your firewall, those days are gone, right? And you heard it, at our general session. Transactions are flowing through all these apps, right? So how do we look at SOD holistically? The other thing that's the big push here is this push from desktop to mobile, IoT to RPA, right? So there really is all these new complexities that are coming about from all this new technology, and it's really introducing a lot of new risk when it comes to SOD, right? So as we move to the next slide, wanted to hit on quickly. So we talked about the technology that's driving a lot of this, right? So this push to the cloud, but it's really not just the technology that's adding this complexity, right? Obviously everybody knows that COVID changed the way we work forever, right? The ability to work from home, to work from everywhere, to work remotely became a necessity, and now it's become the new normal, right? What we saw over the last, 12 to 15 months with COVID, we saw a lot of people that had to work remote, and not only that, had to take time off work because either they had COVID, they were caring for a loved one who had COVID, or, with the whole school situation, there was childcare issues, they couldn't be at work. So what we saw was a lot of people wearing a lot of hats to keep these businesses running. And, there's definitely going to be inherent SOD issues that come across from that. Right. The other thing we're seeing right now is just this boom in the economy that's coming, and a lot of it is being driven by the deal market, right? So organizations that were waiting because of COVID and taking a hesitant approach on, are we going to acquire a new company? Are we going to make moves? Those things are happening now, and it's at a rate right now in the market that we haven't seen in a very, very long time. And so when you go through M&A, there's a lot of, there's things that come with that, right? You acquire a new business, you're getting all those IT landscapes, you're getting all those processes. How do you integrate that? And we all know it's not a light switch, right? It's not overnight. You acquire them and then all your processes and systems are integrated, right? So there's going to be that period of adjustment where you have to deal with a lot of these issues that are going to cause SOD, security and data access issues. And Joe, if you don't mind me kind of putting you on the spot here, I know you have a client in particular that you're working with right now, and it's not just M&A, it's divestitures, it's JVs. There's a lot of this activity happening, and that's causing, data segregation issues, security issues. Maybe you can talk about.
And Nick, it's even kind of beyond, what we traditionally think of as SOX, right? We have a joint venture with a foreign entity. We have different regulatory requirements and all kinds of other factors that we need to consider beyond just passing a SOX audit as well. And I think that's kind of where we're going here with a lot of this, Mick.
Yeah, absolutely. And where does that leave us? It means, I think I can say that the first SOD related consulting engagement I worked on was probably around 2005, right on the heels of, SOX, right? The big SOX boom. And then once we had all the push for SOX, then SOD was not far behind. So like I said, my first one was in 2005, and here we are 16 years later. SOD is not only still a problem, it's getting worse. And so a couple of the statistics on this page just to highlight. The first one, KPMG does a material weakness study every year for all the material weaknesses that are noted in SEC filers every year. And as you can see here in our most recent study, 32% of IPO companies had of material weaknesses to IPO companies were due to SOD. And then when you look at non-IPO companies, It's not much better. 27% of the material weaknesses disclosed were related to SOD. So this is still a big problem. Like I said, a lot of these factors that we're mentioning are just making it worse. And then when we talk about the root cause of what is pushing a lot of this, a lot of it are these factors: technology, M&A, COVID. But really, where it starts to break down is we've seen that almost a third of companies are still doing this manually using things like Excel, Word, and email, right? So there's no, there's no automation being leveraged here, which is really driving a lot of these failures and a lot of these issues. So why don't we move on to the next slide, Pam? And that brings us to what we're calling next generation SOD. And it really gets to a lot of what we were talking about, like I said, in the general session, which would be when you think about SOD, it's no longer thinking of it in a silo and what's passing through a specific application. It's really looking at the life cycle of a transaction end to end. Where does that transaction originate? Where does it end? Where are all the places it stops in between across your front, your middle, and your back office applications? And are you covering SOD across that entire landscape, right? So that's where we want to focus. And so with that, I think we're going to get to our first couple poll EV questions, pulse questions we're calling them. And so given what we're talking about here, especially in light of that statistic we were showing around a lot of people are doing this manually, do you today have a tool that can handle cross applications? There's not a lot on the market, right? A lot of them, such as SAP's GRC access control, works only with SAP, for example. So do you have the tooling today to be able to look across applications? We'll give you a minute to answer those. And as I see the results coming in, it's not surprising that the majority are answering no. That is what we're seeing is the most common right now in the market, that companies are struggling with this. The tooling on the GRC side is not keeping up with the pace of innovation on the application side is very common. And maybe we'll move, I think we had another one that was coming up. Yes, and this kind of gets to the crux of it, right? Now, understanding, as Joe mentioned, this is not about SOX anymore, right? This is about preventing fraud and keeping your data secure. But this is a good, we think this is a kind of a good kind of litmus test. How many apps are in scope for SOX standpoint? Because what we're seeing is typically your SOX applications are in scope for SOD. And as we work through that, we are seeing that the overwhelming majority of our results that are coming in are, most people have more than 10 applications in scope for SOX, right? So you can see where these things diverge, right? Most people have more than 10 apps, and most people do not have a tool that can work across those apps. So that kind of leaves us where we are with a lot of inefficiencies, right? And manual reviews that can lead to a lot of SOD issues, right? All right, so I'm going to hand it off now to Joe, who's going to kind of dive in a little bit more around this SOD 3.0 framework and how it can be leveraged in scenarios like this.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nick. So over the next couple of slides, we're going to take a look at, what is some of our current and what we're kind of seeing most commonly in the market around SOD with our clients. And then we're going to take a look at, where we're going with separation of duties 3.0, as well as our target operating model and our methodology and path for getting there. So this slide is kind of a refresher. I think just based on some of the poll results that we saw, it's going to be pretty familiar to a lot of the individuals in the call today, because we're focusing on SOD within one system, like Mick mentioned before. There's a high degree of change going to cloud, IoT, RPA. Now we have a lot of other inputs and outputs into our primary system, and a lot of other applications considered for SOX. Historically, we're seeing, in SAP, for example, when we have GRC, we're running it just on our main box, whether that's ECC or S4, and maybe we're using Greenlight or IAG to connect to Ariba or CRM, something outside of that initial scope. But that's kind of a constraint that we're seeing, is that we're just looking at our one main system. That kind of makes it difficult to scale, for the future, as we start to move more to the cloud, more to IoT, more to RPA, and having an SOD program or SOD 3.0 or an enabler, like some of the tools we'll talk about a little bit later, like FastPath, are allowing us to scale some of that change and to get ahead of some of the issues that we're seeing, with a one application or one system SOD tool. I'm going to kind of go through this slide rather quickly here because I think we're familiar with it, but the takeaway really is, these type of events are really showing the inefficiency of security and controls programs as they exist today. And sometimes it can lead to higher costs of compliance and overhead due to a lot of the manual nature of controls. I know Mick mentioned earlier, a lot of the controls are detective. We heard some great examples on the panel. We don't want to, change a business process to comply with SOD, but sometimes our higher risk SODs are going to be harder or impossible to eliminate. But where possible, we want to make sure we're getting ahead and implementing a preventative control and active monitoring across applications rather than having a detective control, picking up on a potential conflict or, an actual, issue that happened, after the fact. So if we go to the next slide here, we're talking about if we can go, Pam, to the next one. Oh, perfect. So we're talking about the benefits of SOD 3.0. And, we're hitting on that front, middle, and back office. So we want SOD across the enterprise, both on-premise and on cloud. I think that's a huge change that we're seeing coming into the market. And I know some of our clients are already starting to adopt those types of, configurations, discussions around SOD, considerations. I know historically a lot of them have been manual in terms of types of review controls, but a lot of that's built into more automation. So designing a more persistent and preventative SOD controls in the environment is what we're looking to do. It's pretty key. What that means is relying on SOD as the control and then developing a program around it to prevent SOD conflicts where possible. And we'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about the target operating model. But an SOD program is ultimately going to be a balance between running operations day to day, running a business, obviously, and then also managing risk and getting it to an acceptable and allowable level. Our target model will be a combination of SOD controls, both manual and automated, that can be preventative and detective in nature. None of that's not going to change too much from hopefully the current environment, right? But just the scope of work, the scope of coverage around SOD is what we're increasing, and the level of assurance and preventative nature is what we're trying to increase as we move forward and adopt some of the new technologies. So in order to achieve this persistent nature of SOD compliance, we see that organizations are using more automated solutions. They're being more efficient in both application security management as well as SOD monitoring. And a couple of these solutions that are available in the market, we're going to look at one in a case study towards the end of the presentation or the middle of the hour, is going to be around our tool called FastPath. And lastly, I alluded to this a little bit before when we talked about the detective nature of controls and some of the manual processes. We're going to look at the overall cost and cost savings. The upfront cost of implementing a tool like this, it can be argued that it's 100% necessary, especially where we're going. But in the end, we're going to be able to reduce the amount of manual effort across the organization. So our people will be able to focus more on the day-to-day business and driving progress within the organization rather than monitoring SOD for the sake of controls. Ultimately, that will result in lower cost of ownership and ultimately the lower cost of your application security landscape. Pam, if we can go to the next slide, please. So we kind of talked about the what, what we're talking about for security and SOD 3.0. And now I want to talk about the how we're going to do that. And Pam, on the next slide, we get into our target operating model. And I really like this slide a lot because it drives home that there's really 4 arms as part of SOD: your people, your process, and technology, and really the glue that holds it together, the governance. We need to have all 4 of these areas really well covered down in order to have a successful SOD landscape. So we've highlighted that SOD does not only have one risk or one benefit, the same holds true for the definition of target operating model. Right? From a people perspective, we need to make sure that we have a very dynamic range of ownership and the framework is shared. So we have business, IT, and compliance involved. Sometimes we see that, some of the configuration is owned by IT and some of the decisions that are being made by the business, but maybe it causes a conflict down the line. it's really important to have that cohesion among business, IT, and compliance to help drive successful SOD. We also talk about process. The process needs to be adaptable for the business requirement changes to ensure that there's little or no disruption in operations. This can only be achieved with the proper alignment in IT and the business. I'm going to hit on that a lot. We can't create SOD controls or monitor SOD conflicts in a silo. It needs to be across the organization. And those controls need to be both preventative and detected, based on the type of risk to ensure that we're identifying risk and resolving them in real time. And then technology. The technology is very important. We talk about that in terms of enablers. Talk about GRC, FastPath, IAG coming up down the pipe very soon, and S4 and SAP. But the target operating model needs to include risk considerations across the end-to-end business process for front, middle, and back office. We talked about before some of the constraints, or maybe we're looking at one ERP system right now. We're not looking at the front or middle office. And then lastly, governance. I mentioned this is the glue that holds everything together. Without a strong governance model and a process for change or an IDM solution, it's very hard to continue to maintain a strong SOD environment. It's very infrequently that we have a set it and forget it type of SOD environment. Mick mentioned that mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures, the market is on fire right now with a lot of this activity. I don't know if any of your organizations are going through it directly, but that's where we see the most risk of SOD, trying to onboard those different businesses, trying to divest, operating two different business units within the same ERP. You name it, it's probably been considered as a conflict, especially by your external audit. We'll go on the next slide here. So we have 5 steps, and I apologize, I'm trying to speed up through this here. We have quite a robust deck, but we've worked with a lot of the individuals on the call before, and a lot of us might recognize this as our powered enterprise solution here for SOD. So we talk about the 5 phases: envision, validate, construct, deploy, and evolve. So in order to effectively implement the SOD 3.0 framework, we've broken this down into 5 steps. We're going to use the example here where it's tailored to FastPath to achieve the efficient target operating model. So in the envision phase, this is really the design phase, and it aligns our SOD requirements with the goals and the needs of the organization. In the validate phase, we're going to look at the requirements that we defined, both working with the business, IT, and compliance, and to help develop a solution or a module to support our overall target operating model. Construct is our build phase, and it incorporates the configuration of all the defined requirements from envision and from validate. And then these configurations and functionality will enable your organization to more efficiently monitor access controls and enterprise risk access. Deploy is how the solution will support the target operating model. As stated before, an IDM solution, even FastPath, it's not a set it and forget it or one single magic solution, but it plays a key part in the overall process as an enabler and an effective tool for the organization, both in terms of people and process and governance, to effectively execute strong segregation of duties, monitoring, and resolution. And then lastly is evolve. I think this is the theme of the entire presentation, is that change is inevitable. Our target operating model and management of the FastPath solution can be scalable, and it can handle the organization and change that we're seeing in the future, both from a cloud basis and on-prem basis, and also from our front, middle, and back office. So with that, we'll move on to the next slide. Sorry, Mick, I'm trying to get us to our case study here. We'll just quickly hit on this pause question.
You're doing all right.
How confident is everybody that their current SOD rule set addresses risk and compliance and is free of false positives? I'm hoping that we're not going to see too many on option D there for not applicable. I hope that we're all monitoring SODs in some capacity. So I'm happy that I'm seeing somewhat confident. That's a great response. I'm glad to see that.
Yeah, this is pretty common, I would say, these results as we see it.
Yeah.
Very few, very confident is what we're seeing, and that's normal. And why don't we just to wrap this up, you guys can answer these questions. We'll have those come in. But let's go. Just the last section we wanted to do. We had a question in there: is what are the technology platforms that are available? I answered it. The leaders in the market probably are FastPath, and then there's a company called Pathlock, which used to be called Greenlight Technologies. green light or path lock was more built on you have access control for SAP. How do I extend that? FastPath kind of started out in some of these other ERPs like NetSuite and Microsoft, and they've eventually just started expanding and expanding, and they've got quite a library. So we're going to show you FastPath. This is what we use very frequently. We're a customer of FastPath and an alliance partner with them. So if we go to the next slide, just really quick, we'll spin through these. This is an example of how you can set up in this one. The company's got Coupa for procurement, SAP is their ERP, and Workday for HR. So as you can imagine, there's lots of cross app that would happen there. As we move next on how we set this up, the next is setting up the rule sets, right? So you're going to want to set up a rule set that can enable cross-app SOD. And in this one, we have, two conflicting functions, maintaining expense reports in Coupa, and then post a journal entry in SAP. Now, as we move to the next level, then how do we monitor against that, right? So this is where we set it up. We've got the two different rules or functions that we want to define, right? So we keep the maintain expense reports and all the permissions associated with that. That is maintained on the Coupa side, post journal entry on the SAP side. And then lastly, we get to our results. And then this is how we kind of work through all these results, right, within the system. So I know I went through that very quickly in the interest of time, and I know we have 1 minute. Want to give everybody time to get to their last breakout session. I haven't seen, let's see, do we have some questions that have come in here? As I look through this, is there an argument to be made for limiting the amount of SODs in S4 to only the higher critical risk ones? If ones have a lower moderate risk, is it best practice to still implement them? Yeah, I think I would agree, just seeing that question that was asked. I'd say not necessarily don't monitor them, because risk profiles change over time. So it's always good to have them in the system. But yes, I think it's very typical to have, an approach whereby you're only addressing kind of the higher critical risk ones. That's kind of what very common to what we see is, take away access if they have higher critical, put in a mitigating control if it's a medium risk, and then a low risk, we just report on it and keep eyes on it. So I hope that answers the question. If there are other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or Joe directly. You'll find us on LinkedIn. And I want to give you guys time to check out and head to your next breakout session. So I hope everybody's enjoying the session.
Mick, real quick, there's one question here. The list of applications supported by FastPath, I think that's a fun one because the list keeps getting longer and longer. Did you want to take that?
Yeah, I can tell you right now, in terms of out of the box, just cloud and on-premise applications, it's upwards of 30 that they have, but they also have a connector that they call their universal product integration, which we've hooked up. If there's homegrown apps or mainframes or something like that, that's not common, like a Workday or SAP, it can accommodate that as well. So you can get pretty flexible on it. All right, with that, we're going to be shutting this one down and waiting for the next group to come in. So thanks to everybody. Hope you enjoy your next sessions.
Thank you. Yeah, Mick, I have my coffee on the one side, the water on the other. Vivian did not sleep between 1 and 3:30 last night. So,
that's what a new baby will do for you.
Yeah, it was lovely, I got to tell you. But she's sleeping like an angel today, so.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks to everybody who's joining. We're just giving people a minute to sign out of their previous sessions and get into the next one. Feel like, it's hard to tell if these are all new folks, but I guess we're going to have to just assume we got a new group here now, aren't we, Joe?
Yeah, I saw some leave, some are coming back. I hope the number starts going back up because we had like 70 last time, let's say.
And Mick, just to confirm, is this just the same presentation as what you guys just ran through?
It is, Carlos. You might want to check something else out.
Yep. All right. Thanks.
Any other questions? Give me a shout, Carlos.
Yep.
We'll
Sounds
try to
good.
do SOD 4.0 next year, though. So.
Sounds good, guys. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So if you're still a holdover from the last session, this is a repeat, or we'll call it an encore presentation. Please feel free to check out some of our other breakout sessions as well. And I think since we're at 3 minutes after, why don't we go ahead and jump into it as people are joining? That sounds good.
Hey, Mick, just give us a few seconds to reset the poll.
Oh, you got to reset the poll?
Yep, just doing that right now.
Okay. Well, can I go through the intros while you're doing that?
Sure.
Yes.
Just let me know. Sorry, just wanted you to be aware.
No, it's all good. Keep me honest. We want to make sure people can answer the poll questions. But I just wanted to say thanks to everybody for joining us for this breakout session. So the topic today is SOD, or separation of duties, and this is kind of a new way of looking at SOD. We're calling it SOD 3.0, or next generation separation of duties. And this really gets to some of the points that we raised in the general session around these transformations that are driving into multiple apps, and how do you manage SOD across all these complex application landscapes. So my name is Mick McGarry. You might remember me from the general session. I'm the application security lead at KPMG. And joining me today is Joe Frankowski, who is a managing director in our GRC Technology practice as well. And we are looking forward to the discussion today. And before we jump in, I think Pam or Madeline, have we gotten the poll EV ready to go?
Just a second, Mick. Give us about 10 more seconds. Hang on.
Okay, maybe we could advance the slide while that's going. So once this is done, it should be ready any minute here from a poll EV session, just like we did for the general session and your last breakout. We will be using poll EV to ask some pulse questions that can add to our discussion, just to hear from you. And the web URL that we're going to have there is pollev.com/SOD052021. So SOD and today's date. So that will be, if it's not working up now, it will be in the next 30 seconds, and we will have that URL is going to be on all the slides as we proceed. So maybe we can jump into the content, Pam. All right, so just an agenda. We're going to start with an overview of what do we mean by SOD 3.0. We'll get into our target operating model and how we address that, and then we will be jumping into a case study of an accelerator that we use and that we ally with in the market called FastPath. And if there's time, we will answer some questions. So as we jump into the content, I think I like to start out with a case study which says, why are we all here today? So I like to start with this. And if you're not familiar with the documentary called All the Queen's Horses, this is a fantastic documentary that you can see. It was on Netflix. I believe it's on Amazon Prime now. But it's the story of a woman who worked for the small town of Dixon, Illinois. And over the course of about 10 or 12 years, she embezzled upwards of $53 million. And really, it's a case study for why SOD should be at the forefront of any organization's internal control structure. She had access to do everything. She was doing all the bank reconciliations, cutting the checks, setting up vendors, you name it. She was kind of the one-stop shop. She was eventually caught because she took a vacation and people started to notice things when she wasn't there. But it's called All the Queen's Horses because she used all these ill-gotten gains to start a competition show horse business. And she was actually quite successful at it. And she was flaunting it really in front of everybody, but nobody asked any questions about where she's getting all this money from. But she was eventually caught and again the documentary is fantastic. It gets into where were the auditors when this was happening and all that stuff. So it was just a really good watch if you're into this sort of thing. And I'd like to think you are if you're at this session right now. So anyway, so as that level sets why we're here, we'd like to talk about kind of how what was that, Jeff?
One other thing too about everyone involved, the auditor and the bank both were sued and paid restitution in the millions as well.
That's right.
Because they failed to detect or prevent the fraud. So that's pretty interesting.
Absolutely. There's a role for everybody to play here.
Yeah.
So why don't we move on to the next slide? And this kind of gets to some of what we were talking about in the general session. And we call this innovation for better and for worse, right? Because for better, we've got all this new technology, these new cloud-based applications that give us more real-time access to data, how to run our businesses faster, more efficiently, more access to data, access it from anywhere, right? True mobility. The old way of doing things, as we said, where you have all your transactions run through one back office ERP that sits on premise behind your four walls of your company firewall, those are gone. Those days are gone. SAP is leading a lot of this push to the cloud, right? With their connected apps, Ariba, SuccessFactors, Concur, C4HANA, just to name a few. They're pushing S4HANA to the cloud, right? So there's a lot of this push that's happening in the marketplace, right? And as risk professionals, it is great to run your business more agile, but there is risk that comes with this, and SOD is a big part of that. And as we move to the next slide, it's not just technology that is driving this, right? There's a lot of things in the market that we're seeing that's pushing some of this increasing complexity and risk. We know that COVID really changed how we work forever, right? 15 months ago, it was completely different. Now we've got remote work from anywhere, flexible work arrangements. And just in the last 12 months, right, we've seen people that have had to take time off of work because they had COVID, they were caring for a loved one who had COVID, or maybe, just because of childcare and the schools and everything that was happening, people had to miss a lot of work. So what that meant was a lot of people had to wear a lot of hats in order to keep these businesses afloat. And that's where we saw a big uptick in SOD risk that was happening as people were just, wearing a lot of hats in their organizations. The second thing that we're seeing in the market that's driving a lot of this complexity is M&A activity. We're seeing, with this bounce back from the economy, we're seeing M&A activity like we've not seen in years. Organizations that put off acquisitions are kind of going at hyperspeed right now, and I'm sure some of your organizations might be going through this, but we're seeing so much of this. And when the deal market heats up and M&A activity goes in, there's a lot of residual effects, right? You acquire a new business, you get with them all of their systems, all their processes, and we know it's not a light switch to say, hey, now we're all integrated. So there is growing pains, and then how do we integrate those systems? How do we integrate those processes? That's another thing that's driving a lot of SOD risk that we're seeing. And Joe, maybe you can give a quick example. I know you're working with a company that's working through this right now, and you're having to kind of segregate access across a joint venture that you're working with, which is very similar.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not only a SOX consideration, but also other types of regulatory requirements. They're actually embarking on a JV with a South African company. And part of the condition of the JV is that, there's obviously trade secrets, competitive advantages that need to be segregated, through the system that they're bringing on to both SAP and then also some of their front and middle office applications as well. So it's a part of a process that's been taking the better part of the last year to complete, but it just really highlights the importance of having an SOD program that involves your people, process, and technology and is scalable to the point that you can account for new risks and new business processes that are onboarding to your primary ERP and also your front and middle office applications.
Yeah, thanks. And
sure.
And what does all this mean? It means that SOD is still a big problem. The example I give is I did my first SOD consulting engagement in 2005 with the SOX boom that came there, and here we are 16 years later, and not only is it still a problem, it's getting worse. And a couple of the statistics on this slide just to highlight that. KPMG does a material weakness study every year where we analyze all the material weaknesses that are disclosed in SEC filers. And what we're seeing in our most recent report was that 32% of IPO companies that had material weaknesses, those material weaknesses were related to SOD. And when we look at non-IPO companies, just all public companies in general, it's not much better. It's 27% of all MWs disclosed were related to SOD. So this is still a big problem. And when we talk about a lot of the root causes of why is this still a problem? Yes, there's all the things we talked about, the technology impacts, the COVID impact, the M&A impact. But this last one here is a big driver too, which kind of gets to our framework and how we can do better, is that we're seeing almost a third of the people out there are using manual monitoring methods, right? Using desktop applications like Excel and Word and email to manage SOD, which is neither efficient nor sustainable, and that leads to a lot of issues. So as we move on to the next slide, this kind of gets us to what we're talking about when we say next generation SOD. And this gets to no longer looking at SOD kind of at an application level to say, we have our, the old way of doing it is we have SAP GRC that interfaces with that, and we look at all our SOD risks on SAP because that's what our tool does. It's kind of getting that out of the way and saying, what is the SOD risk from looking at a transaction's life cycle? Where does that transaction originate? Where does it end? What are all the applications it passes through across front, middle, back office? And how do you address SOD throughout that transaction's life cycle? Right, so that's the first step. So I think that'll bring us to our first Pulse question as we get into it. So the first one, we've talked about this, is a big part is the technology, right? Do you currently have an SOD tool that supports cross-application SOD reviews? Because as we noted from that statistic, a lot of the folks do not, and they're handling this manually, and that's really what's driving a lot of the material weaknesses and issues that we're seeing. So as I see the results coming in, yes jumped out to an early lead, but coming on strong and overtaking it by a couple links here at the end is no. So
yeah, I mean, this group has a lot more cross-app SOD monitoring than the prior session.
That is true. That is true. But it is kind of hitting with the trend that the majority of the folks that we see, we've had about half the people respond here, but the majority of the folks do not have an application that supports or a tool that supports cross-application SOD reviews. And then that brings us to the next question that we have, which kind of goes hand in hand with this, which is how many applications are in scope for managing SOX compliance at your organization? Understanding, like Joe said, this goes beyond SOX, right? And that all the Queen's horses example is a good example of that. That wasn't really SOX, that was fraud risk that you're trying to do away with. But we do see it as a good litmus test, as SOX apps tend to be what drives what's in scope from an SOD standpoint for most organizations. And so as we see this come in here, again, it's pretty consistent. We are seeing the majority of folks have 10 or more apps in scope from a SOX standpoint. So we've asked this question at a number of these breakouts that we've had, and that seems to be the consistent response. And so it really matches up with what we're seeing in the market, that most people have lots of apps in scope, but don't have a GRC tool that can actually monitor across those apps. Okay, and so Joe, why don't you take us through what we're seeing in some of these challenges and how we move into our target operating.
Sure, Mick. And over the course of the next couple of slides, we're going to follow a theme here where we talk about what we're seeing a lot of in the market as of today and current SOD. We'll take a look at some of the advantages of what we're calling separation of duties 3.0, as well as a target operating model and the method for actually implementing a tool like FastPath to monitor cross-application SOD. So we'll spend a couple minutes on this slide now and talk about some of the challenges that we're encountering in our current SOD framework. So regarding the scope of SOD, we continuously see organizations target SOD risk to only one system within their environment. You know, a lot of times that's your ERP, maybe it's S4 or ECC. And I think this is creating kind of a false sense of coverage and still exposes the organization to a great deal of risk if we're not looking at some of our front or middle office apps, like maybe CRM, for example, if we're doing some contracting. You know, and the auditors now historically have looked at just that one ERP system that, you know, may have been okay in the past or in you know, prior audits, but you know, as we're looking more and more into the risks associated with an end-to-end business process, we're finding that by not looking at front, middle, and back office applications, we're exposing ourselves to a great deal of risk and are leaving ourselves uncovered. Another challenge is the change in scalability. You know, in many instances, the organization's SOD program isn't really scalable or manageable for change. I mean, that kind of ties back to the JV example that I gave earlier. You know, same goes true for mergers and divestitures, where, you know, you're going to have two different legal entities operating on the same system. There's going to be two different ways of doing things, different users. You know, we need to be able to account for some of that change and not expose ourselves to risk, you know, both potential fraud or maybe loss of competitive advantages or other, you know, types of regulatory compliance matters. Also, we're seeing as we're migrating to cloud and IoT and RPA, there's other risks that are being introduced outside of just our on-prem application, and we need to be able to make these types of changes in a very short period of time. So in summary, these types of events are just an overall inefficient security and controls program is actually leading us to a higher cost of compliance and overhead due to the high degree of manual controls that are often put in place to help to mitigate some of these risks. You know, we see that clients are allowing some of the risks to continue, but they're taking a tremendous amount of personnel hours to actually review activity. You know, it's an issue for two reasons. One, it's probably an inefficient use of resource and time when they could be spending it elsewhere on business growth or you know, improvement. And then it's also, you know, very detective in nature. So we're only going to find out if something actually occurred, and only if it's even detectable. You know, we're totally missing that preventative front end there. So that kind of leads us into our next slide. And we're going to be talking about refining the SOD benefits or the benefits of SOD 3.0. It's going to harp on the theme of our front, middle, and back office applications, as well as on cloud and on-prem. You know, so looking holistically at SOD across the front, middle, and back office functions, this includes assessing our cloud applications within the organization and also any additional risk areas like the ones mentioned by Mick for RPA and IoT. You know, we want to work on designing a more persistent and preventative SOD controls structure within the internal control framework. That's going to be key. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later as well. We talk about the target operating model around people, process, and technology. So what this means is relying on SOD as the control and developing a program to prevent SOD conflicts wherever possible. An SOD program is always going to be a balance between running operations and managing our risk. Ultimately, the target operating model will be a combination of both the SOD controls for manual and automated controls, and also preventative and detective types of controls. So in order to achieve persistent and pervasive nature of SOD compliance, organizations we find are using more automated solutions to be efficient in both the application security management as well as SOD monitoring. You know, some of these solutions in the market are widely available, and they're really effective at systematically assessing the SOD risk across the entirety of the business process that we define within the SOD framework. And again, that translates to end-to-end business process. So lastly, cost and cost savings. The overall efficiency and scalability of the security program or model will be lower, and the cost of ownership of your application and security landscape will also be lower. It's kind of like what we talked about, you know, eliminating some of the monitoring controls and detective controls and getting out in front with more automation and preventative controls. So we can move on to the next slide, Pam. We talked a lot about, you know, where we are and what, but let's focus a little bit now on how we're going to get there. And this is like what we alluded to in terms of target operating model. So on the next slide, this is one of my favorite slides overall, because it kind of shows the four arms of separation of duties 3.0. Right? We have people, process, technology, and governance. And governance is really the glue that holds all of this together. So when we talk about people, we're talking about, within an organization, we're talking about the business, IT, and compliance. It's imperative that we're getting input across all three areas. We can't develop an SOD program within one siloed rule set or within IT, for example. We really want to have a development of a program where both business and IT are working together, and compliance is also involved to help to make sure that the mitigated controls are appropriate, the risk is appropriate. Really, that's just the leading practice for developing a program. Next, we talk about process. The process needs to be adaptable for business requirement changes to ensure that little to no disruption operations take place. The idea is not that we're implementing SOD as part of the way to do business, but that SOD is enforceable within our native business processes. This can only be achieved with proper alignment of IT and the business. That harks back to our people again. And the process needs to include both preventative and detective. I think I've probably said that about 4 or 5 times now. Preventative is definitely where we want to be, but oftentimes some of the higher critical risk, and as Mick mentioned, with leave of absence or the whole pandemic and COVID that's going on right now, we had a lot of people wearing a lot of hats. So sometimes the best course of action or the most achievable course of action was more detective controls, with a higher degree of precision. We also want to talk about technology, and in these cases, we're talking about GRC or IAG if we're talking about SAP, and then also other enablers like FastPath to monitor SOD across applications in your front, middle, and back office. So the integration implementation of IADM solutions provide the organization with a much more efficient management of SOD risks. Governance, I hate that I mentioned this one last because this is incredibly important. This is obviously, like I mentioned before, the glue that holds everything together. SOD is not by any stretch of the imagination a set it and forget it type of, control or program. We talked about how businesses are moving, acquisitions, mergers, divestitures, JVs. These are all catalysts for change in the environment and can overall impact our risk appetite and our SOD position. Organizations need to have an effective process in place to manage changes in security, changes in controls, and the overall business functions. All right, we can go into the next slide now. And we'll talk about our 5 steps and our path to SOD. And for a lot of our clients that we worked with before, you'll recognize this as one of our powered methodologies, where we cover envision, validate, construct, deploy, and involve. Envision, this is the design phase that aligns the SOD requirements with the goals and needs of the organizations. Within validate, based on the requirements of the solution or module design, it's developed and supports the target operating model. Construct, this is really our build phase, and it incorporates the configuration of all the defined requirements from our envision and validate phases. These configurations or functionality will ultimately enable your organization to efficiently monitor access controls and enterprise access risks. Deploy is how the solution supports our target operating model. And as stated before, an IDM solution, even FastPath, is not the sole solution or the magic key, but plays an important role in the overall process. It's imperative that we still have our people and our process and our technology embedded as one and under one governance model that's adaptable and scalable to the business. And lastly is evolve. If one thing, this is really the theme of our SOD 3.0 workshop today, is that change is inevitable. Target operating model and management of FastPath needs to be scalable to handle the organizational changes both now and in the future, especially as we go to a more cloud-based framework and have other ancillary systems outside of our historical core ERP packages like S4 or ECC. And with that, we can go on to our next pulse check. So given what we presented over the last couple of slides, I just want to kind of gauge how confident is everyone that their current SOD rule set addresses the risk and compliance and is free of false positives. I'm hoping that we don't have any non-applicables at the end there, but just to kind of gauge where we are.
Yeah, and again, the results tend to hold pretty true across these multiple sessions we've had. Very few, very confident, most people somewhat confident, and some not confident as well, which again is normal. Again, given all the rate of change and trying to keep up with things, I know we do have. I've got a couple clients that have multiple people that their job is to sift through false positives on SOD reports, which can be maddening, right? And shouldn't be. And so as we try to wrap this up, I know we've only got a few minutes left. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, but a lot of people always ask, well, what are the platforms out there on the market, GRC tools that help work in this next generation environment where you need to go across applications? There's a couple big ones on the market. FastPath is one that we are a alliance partner and we're a customer. We use this tool whenever we do audit and advisory engagements because it is flexible and can go to any app. Others on the market include Pathlock, which used to be known as Greenlight Technologies, as well as, again, SAP has their GRC tool, and now they have the IAG, Identity and Access Governance, which connects to only SAP cloud apps. Again, it's not going to get you to any non-SAP apps, though. So in this example, we're just kind of showing when we utilize FastPath and team with them. One example we have here is a business that has Coupa as a front office app for procurement, SAP as their backend ERP, and Workday for HR. So these are all easily set up within the application. As we move to the next slide, then it becomes how do we define these rules, right? So in this one, we have our different rule sets across these apps, and we have them defined at the function level to define what is a cross-app SOD. In this example, it is maintain expense reports within Coupa, which conflicts with post-journal entry within SAP. On the next slide, we dive into how do we build this out, and this is going to look similar to if you have SAP GRC, what they call it the function level, but this is kind of building out those permissions. What are the T codes? What are the objects? The permissions you need across these apps, and how you're defining that access. And then once that's run, that gets you to the results on the last slide we have here. And this is how do we action that, right? How do we see the report that gives us what are the user level conflicts across apps, right? And so this kind of gets you, this is, of course, gets you great detective controls. As Joe mentioned, the goal here is to get this into kind of preventive, and that's where you can start to embed some of these into your identity processes and things like that to help prevent these SODs before they're provisioned. And so with that, we are right on time. I'd like to move to Q&A. I know we don't have another breakout session for you to run to, so I'm happy to stick around for a couple extra minutes. If folks have some questions that they would like answered, you can either speak up now, feel free to talk, or put it in the chat and we'll be happy to answer. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions come through or any hands go up. If there are no questions, I do want to, on behalf of KPMG, thank you all for attending our SAP Share Forum. I hope you found the content meaningful on all these sessions, the general session and the breakout sessions. And we hope to be in touch with you soon. If you have any other questions that you'd like to ask offline, please feel free to reach out to myself or Joe directly. You can find us on LinkedIn. Thank you again for your time. Hope you all have a great day. And don't forget to check out of the poll EV. And once you check out, then you'll be good to go. Okay, thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you.